and welcome back to Literally Literary. If this is your first time joining us, be sure to check out our previous episodes. This episode, we are beginning the discussion on the poetry collection Guillotine by Eduardo C. Corral for National Poetry Month. Today we will be introducing the author and the work, discussing a general overview of the themes and other key elements.
Well, thank you for the intro, Vanessa.
Smooth as always.
Yep. What?
I said thanks, guys.
Well, hello everyone. How are you guys? How are you guys doing today?
Are you asking our audience or us?
Both.
Both. Well, we can respond, right?
I hope everyone's doing okay.
Yeah. This is our first intro to a book that is for National Poetry Month that we're really excited to talk about. It is technically May, so it's May Day actually. And the Beltane, that, the spring, whatever festival. This is our book for National Poetry Month in April. We just finished another poetry collection. But we're gonna talk about this one today, just kind of give you all the overview as we usually do with our shows. And those of you who have recently been listening to our shows, we thank you for tuning in, and we hope that you can pick up these books. Guillotine and Eduardo Corral was published last year. What did we want to start with, guys, with this one?
Publication.
A lot of things to say about it, even without going into the specific poems.
Yeah, it's kind of hard to get started, honestly. I think that there's something just if you pick it up in a bookstore, there's something very just almost haunting of the cover of this figure staring at you in a very sensual pose, I would say. I don't know if you guys would agree with that, right? Kind of in a vulnerable kind of position with their back towards you, looking back.
I was more drawn to the colors of the cover. So the figure is completely red, and to me that just kind of looked like muscle tissue or like blood, kind of like.
Oh.
Yeah, I don't.
Yeah, I hadn't thought about it that way.
Definitely see a person of color gracing, I think, the way I see it.
And so it's called I Have Eyes Where They Can Best Protect Me, and it's by the artist Felipe Baeza. I think this might be the first work we've talked about where the cover has a specific artwork. So that's pretty interesting. And the title of that, the title of that art piece, I think you can kind of see some of that in the poems, that vulnerability, the kind of shielding, of the eyes.
And one of the reasons I'll say vulnerability, because it looks like their figure is nude. It's interesting, there's like an uncovering happening, I guess, with the book. But I think we said that there's a lot more to I guess the complexity of just the way the book is put together and split up, and I think that's probably most of what we'll talk about today. It seems,
And before we get to those details, Eduardo Corral is the son of Mexican immigrants. So I've seen that kind of bio before with Jose Olivares. He has that as well. So this is his second book. His first one won the Yale Younger Poets Prize, and it was called Slow Lightning. He has a ton of recognition: the Whiting Award, the National Endowment for the Arts. He teaches at North Carolina State, and this book was longlisted for the National Book Award last year as well. So, so it's gotten a lot of attention. And, in terms of attention, the attention for me came about through a colleague of mine. So shout out to my friend and colleague Rich Yanez, who he's the one who told me, he was like, hey, you guys should do this book, and maybe we could bring him to campus, Eduardo. Because I think I'm sure Rich probably knows him as well, because he knows a lot of the poets and writers, him being a writer himself.
Yeah, that'd be really great. And speaking of friends, I saw a familiar name as well in the back of the cover. One of the first blurbs, actually. And so kind of on that point, right, our friend Natalie Sinter-Sapico here has a nice, not nice, I mean, just like to call it a radical contribution to the American canon. Yeah, that says a lot. And of course, I believe we've shouted Natalie out before on the podcast. So it's always nice seeing a familiar name.
For sure. Yeah. Yeah, these are great blurbs, by the way. Like sometimes the blurbs are like really short. And Grey Wolf. So Grey Wolf this is the first book from Grey Wolf. They're an indie publisher, but they're actually like one of the biggest ones from what I was reading about them. They've published Claudia Rankin, who's on my to read list. She's a poet, and many others. The collection itself.
Yeah.
Where can we start?
I mean, we were talking about some of the funding that went into the book, which I think is interesting. It looks like comes from different foundations of sorts, and you even see, I guess, some organizations as well that took part, including the Clean Water, Land, and Legacy Amendment. That's interesting. Minnesota State Arts Board. And then something that caught our eye was Target. Interesting seeing like a huge corporate brand involved in the publication of a book. And this isn't the first time we've come across this, right?
Right. Yeah, I want to say that was also true of at least one of the other books. And I don't want to say which one just because I don't want to misidentify a book. But yeah, it's always interesting how some of these corporations end up, doing the right thing, right? Despite all the other bad things they do, but yeah. This is a collection that is 19 poems, right? Was it?
Yes.
If we take the Testaments to be one single kind of, we talked about this, right? It's so 1/3 of the collection is what was it, Richie? Did you want to talk about that?
I mean, what was a piece that was I mean, I guess it would be worth acknowledging that just like many of the other collections, there's also a notes section, acknowledgement section. But I would say that Corral's here is very extensive. That there's these notes, these footnotes. And so we do learn that this first section here, Testament scratched into a water station barrel, essentially was, as he says, it had its roots from ekphrasis project, right? And of course, if you're not familiar, that's just a type of writing that's based off of another work of art. So it could be a painting or a piece of music, and it's kind of what created that piece. And so in particular, this was he chose Humane Borders Water Station by Delilah Montoya, which is a photograph of those blue water station barrels in Arizona. So it's a pretty relevant cause, if you're not familiar with the migration routes in the desert and how dangerous it is. And how people try and help by providing water, and how evil people try and sabotage by destroying the water, doing worse things to it. So obviously through this like, ekphrastic poetry, he was able to develop this whole first third of the piece in this testament scratched in a water station barrel.
Yeah, and like you said, it's very obviously very relevant, not just right now, right, but for decades. And of course, it's not the first work where it's dealt with border issues or immigration issues, right, that we've talked about. I like his reasoning for how he came about to end up writing, these pieces on them. He says, they're on 77. After writing my ekphrastic poem, The Water Station Barrel stayed with me. I kept imaging stories, rants, wishes, and confessions that might be scratched into the blue of the barrels. Speakers began to arrive, Mexican and Central American immigrants making visible the worlds inside them. Some of the language, though, belongs to races who vandalize water barrels. Then it dawned on me. The speakers were scratching time and again one water station barrel. So in my mind, this one water station barrel morphed into a three-dimensional communal space, a lyrical expanse scored with human utterance.
Wow. That last description.
Yeah, I mean, it's almost like it's not almost, but it is, right? It's a piece within a piece within a piece here, right? Because the collection contains the ekphrastic, and then the ekphrastic contains the, the, what was it called? The Humane Borders Water Station photo.
Based off of that, yeah. Yeah, one of the things we were noting about structure is this use of notes and daggers and double daggers and notation. And as we learn in literature, surely all this cannot be without meaning.
Right. For sure. The whole collection has the for the caretaker's epigraph that you mentioned, Richie.
Yeah, it's an interesting way of starting that. Because we learn in his acknowledgments that there's a lot of people, you think, and sometimes people kind of conflate, acknowledgments with epic, or the dedication, right? So to the caretakers, it's very simple, but we can identify again, or caretaker can mean a lot of different people.
Yeah, because I mean, that kind of cuts both ways, because there's care that goes into putting a book together, right? And then there's the care that the book writer entrusts upon us to take care of it, in the sense that we honor it. We honor why the author wrote it. And of course, there's other epigraphs, and there's other sections. So that's just one part of it, right? Yeah. The testaments. And then there's other poems. There's a lot of allusions, and I like that the notes, do mention some of those. Was there something about those that stood out to y'all before we get to the acknowledgments?
One of the things that always interests me in cultural production is how works influence other works. And so, you kind of mentioned how these notes here, it always reminds me of just in undergrad and grad school, how some authors kind of had this style in which it was very illusion heavy. So I think of T.S. Eliot right away. Often when we read T.S. Eliot in our classes, you had to also kind of read along with the footnotes, because he did a lot of popular cultural allusions, and were kind of necessary at some point, because those kind of get lost over time. So I do think it's interesting, the documentation, and I think Natalie actually mentioned this mentions this in her blurb here about documenting, but he's documenting his allusions and also this tendency to riff on and allude to other pieces, because that's kind of like I think, I mean, that's how I think it works. Creation requires influence. And I think it's really great that he's acknowledging, so I think he mentions a Rita Dove poem, like the end of it. He says he's riffing on it. He mentions that on 77 as well. I'm on the notes.
Yeah.
And then also just, the Portuguese is taken from here. And he's pretty specific about where he's getting these. And there's something really satisfying about this kind of documenting that he's doing.
Yeah, and it's in its own form of caretaking too.
Exactly. Yeah. Good call.
And it's not just poems, and there's a lot of nonfiction here as well. So, for instance, the epigraph in the poem "Song on the Open Road," which itself is taken from a Whitman piece, is from an Intercept article about immigration and Border Patrol specifically. There's like the pop culture stuff, right? With Juanga and Tigres del Norte. There's more indigenous stuff, right? With the Nahual proverbs in Postmortem. There's from a memoir by Rigoberto Gonzalez, for autobiography of My Hungers. It's quite fascinating the way that of course you expect allusions, but like you said, to document them for the reader, and second to have them in such a variety, I think is quite notable. Before we talk about the kinds of poems that we get, what about the acknowledgments? Did you all notice?
There's just a lot of people that he's thanking, which I think is something that we talk about often, is like just how many people it takes to actually have a book published.
Yeah, I like how he introduces all the people that in one form or another helped him. He says very specifically attentiveness, kindness, right? And I love the way he says nourished me as he wrote these poems. And of course we were, getting to geek out and fangirl a little bit over names. We're like, oh, look, yes.
Yeah.
Names we know, Erica Sanchez and Tracy Smith, right? We're just kind of looking for these names that we remember.
Yeah. Andrea Beltran.
Yeah.
A couple of my good friends I haven't seen since the NCT conference, Steven Alvarez and Sarah Alvarez, Marcelo Hernandez Castillo, who has that memoir, Natalie Diaz, whose work I think was also longlisted last year, Postcolonial, I think it's called. Speaking of caretaking, he has a note here thanking the Princeton, saying that it allowed me to move back to Arizona to take care of my father as he recovered from a serious illness. During those scary months, in the quiet hours, I drafted many of the poems in the Testament sequence. And you were talking about Richie creation requires influence, which I totally agree. And, it's not just the influence of the artwork, but I think that clearly the influence of his literal caretaking, right? And I think that's why, and part of the reason why is why he has that dedication.
Yeah. It's all interesting from even out of all this paratextual stuff, we can glean out so much information, that, we haven't even been talking about any of the literal writing yet. Not really.
Right.
But you can glean so much. I think it's fascinating.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's a little thing, and it kind of reminds me a little bit of Olivares, but did you guys notice it's lowercase, the guillotine?
Ever since bell hooks, I tend to pick up on these things.
Yeah. That influenced me too. So it's lowercase there, but then it's like uppercase in the actual title poem, Guillotine. So, and so beyond the aphrastic poem, you know, that does go over many of the things that, you know, migrants go through. It reminded me a lot. I mentioned, you know, Devil's Highway from Lisora, who writes about that, and that work of his Devil's Highway. You know, but we had just finished Benjamin Garcia's collection, you know, and in that one, just like this one, there also you had mentioned to me this one, the first poem, right? What was one thing that stood out to you in the ceremonial, for instance?
There's a lot going on here. Well, from this one, I got obviously that the speaker is religious in some form, some form of Catholicism, whether it's like super religious or not. It's there.
Yeah.
Right. The rosary.
Yeah, and also the idea of rape is kind of hinted at towards here. It's not explicitly said in any, like, at all, but it's kind of hinted at towards the bottom of page 7.
And so that ties into, you know, what we talked about with Thrown in the Throat, right? That vulnerability, the sexual violence. And then, you know, there's that line, I walk into a closet, right? Which has that dual meaning. And, you know, there's that poem, right, in Benjamin's book about, you know, the closet, right? I forget what it's called, but yeah, so that's the first poem. And then we get into the testaments, you know, and even the title itself, right, is really interesting. And you know, that they're not titled in and of themselves, right? So they just become these kind of shards of the broader, you know, collection. But they do have, you know, I'm sure you guys noticed the Roman numerals.
Well, the scratches.
Yeah. And
but it stands out, right?
Yeah,
because we've had we remarked on the use of symbols all throughout the book already.
Yeah, the double daggers, like you said, which, you know, we were looking up, and so that could have its own meaning, right? You know, you were saying it could be a third kind of a footnote, right? You said, or endnote, or asterisk.
I mean, so like the most common application is that it's like a kind of a tertiary type of footnote, right? The first, of course, being an asterisk, the second being a dagger, and the third, right, being the double dagger.
Gotcha.
Right? These two crosses on top of each other, which, you know, the cross is a common image as well, of course, through a lot of this poem.
Right. Yeah, so that's a set of poems, and after that, you know, we get the Guillotine poem, the title poem. That section is enclosed by an epigraph by Luis Munoz, who's another poet. And in there, you know, we find a couple odes, I guess you could call them, to Francisco Alarcón. There's another ode that is to a street man. And then there's a couple other double daggers. That one does not have any kind of epigraph. But there are other symbols, right? Like you were saying, like those in the section that follows. And then another double dagger, and so there's a lot of that's probably the most prominent symbol, the double dagger. And so what were some of the themes that you guys picked up? I mean, we already hinted at some of them, but was there something else that you guys wanted to say that you noticed in the
I just wanted to point out the amount of like desert imagery that's throughout the collection. There's a lot of colors that are mentioned. There's green, the cacti, and I don't know. I could kind of I was able to really picture the desert.
Mm-hmm.
The Sonoran Desert, right?
Mm.
Often mentions saguaro, which we don't have here in our desert. But in Arizona, you do, right? And I think the saguaro is such an interesting looking. It's iconic, honestly, right? People think of deserts,
Yeah.
and of course all the brush, all the bush of the desert landscape, the animals, of course.
And that reminded me a lot of when I was reading that, not just Urea, but also Ben Science, in his Everything Begins and Ends. In terms, more specifically in terms of like how he's able to make the desert, there's a magnificence about it, and again, because the desert kind of like El Paso, right? We get a bad rap, right? The rest of Texas doesn't even know about us. And for the desert, right, a lot of people see it as like this dry, and if it's like Anakin, just they hate the sand, right, or whatever. So I think this is a collection that captures it's a somber tone throughout a lot of it because of the testaments. But like Vanessa was saying, right, there's a kind of dark beauty, for lack of a better word that I can think of, right, of the imagery in it. And
then I also think people don't think of the color green when you mention the desert, but I do think that there is a lot of like life, and there is a lot of green in the desert. It's just a different kind.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Yeah.
And it's contrasted with the water, right? Because there's, it's water stations, right? And you were saying, right, Richie, that, that the Border Patrol, has been caught on tape, like puncturing those, right? Yeah.
And that's murder,
right?
Pretty much.
And wasn't it in Arizona, right, where someone for the water that's something else.
Yeah.
Some of the activists, right, were the ones, of course, who placed the water, and one of them got like booked, right, was like going to go to jail for that,
for helping.
Yeah. For aiding and abetting, right? And
then you have all these militia type peeps who act as a vigilante border patrol, and also try and dissuade and harass those just trying to help by leaving aid,
right,
for travelers,
right,
for migrants.
Yeah, so that's a whole other thing, I think that we could definitely get into in our next episode I think we'll cover most of those, and I think that's the other kind of quote unquote bad rap, right, is the the how people outside the border don't think of, again, the border. They think of the border as like, there's a lot of misconceptions.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of misconceptions also about immigration. So I think I like that this collection is capturing the raw, and it's at the same time, of course, poetic, right? Because I think there's maybe a balance to strike there. Because of course it's inspired by the actual photo, but there's that poetic license that comes in, of course.
Yeah, I mean, it was very intense to read because there were so many voices present, and I'm talking specifically about the Testament section.
Yeah.
And and I actually didn't even read that note till we started this episode, but it makes a lot more sense now because it's a flurry of voices. Again, I think of Whitman's multitudes. I contain multitudes, and you do hear different perspectives, and you definitely hear some of the racists. You hear some bad, terrible jokes thrown in there, and just it's a lot to dig through.
Yeah, now that you mention that, it reminds me of Pat Mora's what's that poem called? Is it called Border Patrol, like, I don't know if you guys have read it, but it's one where it's like a role playing where like one stanza of the poem is the Border Patrol and then the other is the migrant.
Oh.
It might be called Border Patrol, but and it's funny, you know, because I think yesterday or today was Dia del Niño. And she's the founder of it. So, you know, she's a big promoter. She's actually from El Paso, you know, she's a big promoter of literacy. And yeah, I mean, definitely, you know, with these poems, those of us who do see a lot of that or hear those stories, I should say, like you said, right? I mean, I think it definitely is a hard section to get through. And it's haunting almost, right? Because you, of course, think about how many have perished, right? Because of how brutal that landscape is, how unforgiving the desert is for people who are just, of course, trying to make a better living, right? And survive.
Right.
The title poem, you know, in terms of why you guys think it became the title, is on. So it's on page, what was it? 39.
Are we getting into it now?
Or? Well, I mean, just to kind of go over the title, we don't have to get, but I think, you know, it talks about the scorpion and the blade, right? So the imagery is very strong in it.
Sure.
You know, but it's interesting that it's, you know, the guillotine, it's represented as a blade, right? But we could think about the guillotine, right, as a form of execution. And to me, it just kind of reminds me of how, you know, the justice system and more broadly the forms of government that cause undue punishment. You know, and so that's the way I see it.
Right. Yeah. So, kind of not really taking the poem into consideration. If you just come across the word guillotine, you think of something that is violent, right? Again, a method of execution. In whose hands, right? It depends, right? Because a lot of people might also associate with like the revolutionary. Maybe depends. People overthrowing their government. You hear that used a lot. Because I think part of this collection is also kind of about thinking about those structures, the violent structures that hold it all together, and like what does it mean to be part of this state, this nation state. And yeah, I think there's something to explore that we can once we get into it.
Was there something else, Vanessa, that just like glossing over your first impressions, maybe other connections or?
So we've kind of touched about migration and immigration, but there's a specific poem called Border Patrol Agent here, and I think ICE is mentioned for sure. So those aspects are also mentioned.
Yeah, and you know, suffice it to say, as the reader, as the listener might be able to figure, you know, it's of course a very morbid work because of that, right? There's a lot of death here. You know, that poem you mentioned, Vanessa, for instance, mentions the baby caskets. So, you know, I think again, because of that, right? I think it goes without saying there's that, of course, that trigger warning, you know, not just because of the sexual violence, but because of the violence immigrants suffer, you know, and people of color, indigenous people, right? You know, the Central Americans. You know, one of the poems that's the last one, right, is to Juan Doe 234, you know, yeah.
And then also Song of the Open Road talks about U.S. Customs and Border Protection officers.
Yeah, CBP. which contains because it's like a whole umbrella of like, okay, split up agencies absorbed under Homeland Security. I think one of the other things that struck me, I think you mentioned this, Richie, real briefly in the pre-show, is that the besides the actual text of the poems, in this one, for instance, on right before Juan Do, on 69, and I think it's another one in the Testaments, we get the names there superimposed upon each other, right? Just like there was a Testaments one where it had all the things that the those Minutemen, right, that you alluded to, Richie, would scrawl on those barrels, those stations, and stations, of course, here, like you were saying, Vanessa, there's the Catholicism throughout, right? Shades of it. And so I think of course, the Stations of the Cross, right? And there was 12, or whatever it is. And so there's that kind of the passion, right? The passion of the Christ being, not actual passion as we think of, where it's like, love, but passion here is suffering, right? So I think that's another big part of the connection that we see here, of course. So we'll get to it. We'll get to through the first half next time. But yeah, that's a whole whopper, right? There's a whole poem about the whopper there, but
I also wanted to wanted to mention that I think the human body, or specifically the speaker's body, is a really big I guess theme. Just different parts of the body are mentioned throughout.
And going back to the cover, right? It's that, like you were saying, Richie, that it's naked. It's that exposure, right? I'm here exposed, on my backside, right? In the scent. And so there's that kind of, so there's a lot of symbolism there that, like you said, Vanessa, and I feel like, Thrown in the Throat kind of had a lot of that, right? The body symbolism too. And in Hunger, right? There's a poem about hunger, right? And so can't help but think of some always hungry there. And I think it is interesting going back to that aphoristic, where when a poet, takes not only the artwork, but the artwork, of course, is based on actual things, right? And actual reality that immigrants experience. And so I always find it interesting. Now, I've done it myself, where when you write about something that you ascribe some kind of voice, not to the voiceless, but to people who are not you, right? Because of course it's one thing to write about your own experiences, right? But I just think it's goes back to that epigraph, right? Of caretaking, right? There's a greater amount of care that should be taken when you decide to write about someone else's life, and especially these lives that unfortunately many of them died through no fault of their own, right? Or all of them, right? Unless it's like coyotes or something who are exploiting them. I think I'll leave it at that.
Thanks for joining us on this episode of Literally Literary, brought to you by Border Sentences and Power at the Pass. This episode we discussed Guillotine by Eduardo C. Corral. If you haven't read it, we hope we inspire you to pick up a copy. Join us on our next episode as we continue the discussion. Follow us on Instagram at literallyliterary.ep and on Twitter at literallylitep.